Jim Chalmers, welcome to the program. So first up, do you welcome this wage subsidy for 100,000 apprentices?
Well, we welcome any support for apprentices and trainees, and particularly young workers, and any efforts to start to fix the mess that the Liberal government has made of training over the last 7 years or so. We can't afford a lost generation sacrificed to this recession. This is very important that we address some of the issues in training. Now, obviously, it doesn't make up for the 140,000 fewer apprentices that we've seen over the life of this government. There's no long-term vision for training so that people can grab the opportunities in the recovery or be trained up for technological and economic change. And also the government has a lot of form in announcing big numbers, chasing big headlines and then not following through. So we'll go through all of the detail. We'll do all of that work. Subject to all of that, we hope that it's something that we can support.
Just on the specific here, it's women who've suffered most so far in this recession. Apprenticeships are mostly young men. Does more need to be done for women in your view? What would you suggest?
Oh, absolutely, David. Very clearly, women have been disproportionately impacted by this recession. And so we need to make sure that we have a proper, comprehensive jobs plan and not just bits and pieces. We've been saying for some time that we need more investment, for example, in the care economy. We've said that there are other things the government should be contemplating beyond the kind of daily drip feed of announcements. What we need to see on Tuesday night in the budget is not just another marketing exercise, not just a lot of big headlines and big numbers and patting themselves on the back, but we need to see a budget which deals with weakness in the labour market in particular, but also make sure that we're building something that lasts, that we're actually getting bang for buck for these trillions of dollars that the government is borrowing.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how to do that. Is a wage subsidy approach they're announcing today for men and women across apprenticeships and traineeships, is that a model that should be adopted in, I mean, you mentioned the caring sector, aged care, childcare, disability care. Would that be the right approach there too?
Well, two things about that. I mean, first of all, there's an existing wage subsidy, JobKeeper, which is being withdrawn too fast, certainly for a lot of businesses in Victoria where you are, certainly for a lot of businesses in Cairns in far north Queensland where I spent the first half of last week. We are concerned that the existing wage subsidy, which was introduced too slowly and too narrowly, is now being withdrawn too quickly and too bluntly. So that's the existing wage subsidy. In terms of any new proposals that the government might announce on Tuesday night, again, we're prepared to engage constructively on that. I think Phil Curry made a good point a moment ago. There is some complexity there. We want to make sure that we're actually incentivising new jobs and not just paying people for the jobs that might be created in the recovery anyway. But subject to all of that, obviously, we'd be responsible and constructive and open-minded about any new proposals in this space, particularly
that's what we'd hope for. But I expect from an opposition, I'm just wondering, are you actually saying they should do this? They should go for a wage subsidy approach more broadly?
Well, first of all, we're saying reconsider the cuts to JobKeeper, to the existing wage subsidy. There's already a wage subsidy in the system which has the capacity to do a lot of good, but it's being cut too soon for a lot of businesses which aren't recovering fast enough. And what that means is the unemployment queues will be longer and more small businesses will hit the wall because of that decision that the government has
just
taken.
On that though, just on that, as you know, JobKeeper doesn't require a business to be open and operating. I mean, there is a danger that in some parts it's propping up so-called zombie businesses.
Well, it's also propping up businesses which have the capacity to succeed in normal times, David.
Sure.
And that's the point of it. That's the reason why we proposed it. It's the reason why the government came around to our view. The point that we're making is don't withdraw it so quickly that it means that otherwise good businesses hit the wall and the unemployment queues are longer than they need to be. You asked me about a future wage subsidy. That is something the government should be contemplating, but we need to know what else is in the budget to understand whether that's where we'd get most bang for buck.
All right, let me ask you about tax cuts, because we are going to see tax cuts, no doubt, on Tuesday night. Labor last year ultimately passed the government's three-stage tax cuts in the Senate, even though you didn't like stage 3, the tax cuts for high income earners. Are you still opposed to tax cuts for high income earners?
Well, what we were forced to do last time, David, was we were forced to choose between expressing a view on stage 3 and holding up tax relief, which was desperately needed for low and middle income earners, or the reverse. And so what we did was we said that the highest priority was getting that support into the economy as soon as possible, and that's how we voted. The government didn't give the Parliament the opportunity to vote on the different stages despite our best efforts. We've said really throughout that stage 3 is the least affordable, it's the least responsible, it's the least fair, and it's the least likely to get a good return in the economy because higher income earners are less likely to spend in the economy. And it's that spending power that we need in our shops and in our small businesses around Australia. So that's been our view throughout. It won't surprise people to learn that that remains our view about stage 3, and especially if it comes at the cost of other more important initiatives, more effective initiatives like social housing, and other parts of the economy which need help.
On tax cuts, though, my understanding is the government will put forward again a whole package, an omnibus bill for tax cuts. In the event they do that, as they did last year, will you follow the same approach, argue against the top-end tax cuts, but ultimately pass the lot?
Well, we'll finalise our approach, David, when we actually see the package of tax cuts. We don't know what the timing is. We don't know if there are any additional measures that they intend to put up on Tuesday night. I think it would be unusual to come to a view on something we haven't seen yet.
OK, but I'm just trying to get a sense. Will you stand in the way of tax cuts if you're opposed to one component of it?
Well, let's see what they propose, David. I honestly don't think it's reasonable for me to come to a view on the Sunday on tax cuts, which will be announced a couple of days later.
No, OK, but on the existing tax cuts that are in law, the top-end ones that are due to come into effect from 2024, is it still Labor's plan to repeal those, should you win the election?
Well, what we said at the time was that we would look at those stage 3 tax cuts closer to the election. Right. Remember, when they originally legislated, they weren't to come in until 2024, so some years down the track, and we said it would be more responsible to have a look then. If the government changes the timing of those tax cuts, if they change the mix of those tax cuts, we'll consider it then. We've been very clear that we're not against tax relief for low and middle income earners, but we haven't been keen on stage 3 really throughout. For all the reasons I identified. Stage 3 is the least responsible, least affordable, least fair and least likely to be effective in the economy.
OK, so you're still weighing up whether you'd repeal that. You're still weighing up a few things, aren't you? Negative gearing, franking credits. We're not going to see a decision from Labor on these things anytime soon?
Look, we've said that we'll make our tax policies clear closer to the election, and we still don't even have an update to the budget yet. It's been a long time between budgets. We need to take into account all of the economic conditions. We've said that we won't take an identical set of policies to the next election that we took to the last one, but our economic policies, our approach to the budget will be carefully calibrated to the economic conditions. It will prioritise jobs above all else, but also supporting communities and supporting people doing it tough during this recession.
So what does that look like right now?
And investing in the future, investing in the future so that the only legacy of this Morrison recession isn't higher unemployment for too long and $1 trillion plus in debt.
And I'm sure everyone wants to see jobs, but I'm just wondering right now, the Labor alternative path to recovery, you've mentioned you want more on social housing, you don't like the top-end tax cuts idea. The wage subsidy is something you're suggesting more broadly. Is that the alternative approach here?
Well, think of it this way, David. We need to remember that every single dollar here is borrowed, and we need to get maximum bang for buck for that. We measure that effectiveness by what it means for jobs. And we should be thinking about supporting the economy really in 3 ways. First of all, how do we support jobs and incomes in the near term? JobKeeper is part of that, local jobs programs, also potentially government procurement. Secondly, how do we support the economy now but have a lasting benefit? Small-scale infrastructure is a good example there. Social housing is probably the best example. Thirdly, how do we increase the kind of speed limit of the economy over the longer term? Cleaner and cheaper energy, getting more participation in the workforce, teaching and training our young people to grab the opportunities of technological change. These are the sorts of things that the government should be contemplating. It needs to be a comprehensive plan for jobs in this budget, not another marketing exercise which treats people as mugs, and not another headline-grabbing, backslapping exercise which leaves almost 1 million unemployed Australians in the lurch and leaves too many people behind.
All right, just on overall spending. spending here. I mean, you have been critical about too much debt being racked up, and yet at the same time you want the government to spend more on JobKeeper, as you pointed out, JobSeeker, aged care, social housing, universities, childcare. Can you just clear up, do you want the government to spend more or less? That's
not an accurate description of our position, David. We've said all along, we've been consistent now, the beginning. What you said about...
You're not critical of debt.
What the position you put to us on debt, the point that we have made repeatedly for more than a decade now is when the economy is in this much strife as it is today, the priority's got to be jobs. We've said that all along. It's the government that's been...
So you're not critical about the debt?
David.
No. You just wanted to make sure you're not critical about the level of debt. I just want to be accurate about that.
We're critical of the government's spending in some areas, the rorts and the pork barrelling, which has meant that some of this spending we've not been getting maximum bang for buck. We've been critical there. On the levels of debt, we have said now for more than a decade, I've probably said to you hundreds of times in different scenarios, that the priority has to be jobs. It's for the government to explain their inconsistency. When they said that debt, a fifth of what it is now, was a debt and deficit disaster, now that it's many multiples of that, they say that it's manageable. We've been consistent. The government has been inconsistent on that.
Right.
What we're saying about debt and deficit levels more broadly is that every single dollar of this is borrowed money. We need to make sure it's effective. We need to measure that effectiveness by what it means for jobs. Enough of the rorts and the pork barrelling and the wasted money. Every single dollar is borrowed. Let's get maximum value for it. That means ensuring that we're investing in social housing, cleaner and cheaper energy, local jobs programs, all of these sorts of things which will make a genuine difference to jobs in the economy.
And just on the cause of this recession, Jim Chalmers, Anthony Albanese started referring to this as the Morrison recession. Can you just clear this up? Why do you think we're in recession?
Well, it is the Morrison recession. Scott Morrison is the Prime Minister and Josh Frydenberg is the Treasurer.
Does that mean the last recession was the Keating recession?
Well, that's how people generally refer to it, and it's not unfair now, that being the case, that this was referred to as the Morrison recession. It's the first one in 3 decades. It's the deepest, most damaging recession in almost a century. We've always acknowledged that this health crisis is having devastating consequences for the economy and for the budget. But equally, the government needs to acknowledge that some of the decisions they've taken around JobKeeper, their failures to get money out the door, having announced big sums, means that the unemployment queues are longer than they need to be. The recession is deeper and will be longer than it needs to be because of some of the decisions that the government has taken.
OK, but the decisions have been at a state-by-state level around closures, lockdowns, restrictions. As we know, Dan Andrews in Victoria is responsible for the decisions that have been made there. Do you really think people are... I don't know why we're in recession. There's a recession going on globally.
I'm not suggesting that they don't know, David. I'm suggesting that it's the first recession in 3 decades. It's under Scott Morrison. It's the Morrison recession, made deeper and longer. Unemployment queues made longer by the fact that they have botched key aspects of their response. The state governments take responsibility for the decisions that they've taken. Scott Morrison wants everybody doing what you just did a moment ago, David, which is to pretend that anything that goes bad in this economy is a consequence of state leaders' decisions.
No, I'm not saying it's because of their decisions. Sorry, I'm saying they are responsible for the decisions each state has taken on lockdowns and restrictions. I don't think that's in dispute.
No, and neither should it be in dispute that Scott Morrison is responsible for the lateness of the response, the bungling of JobKeeper, the big announcements which aren't followed through on, which means that money isn't getting out the door and into the economy, the failures in aged care, the failures on the COVID Safe app. All of these things are Scott Morrison's responsibility. We shouldn't fall for the trap, as you seem to be doing, of pretending that he's not responsible for anything that's gone wrong in the economy.
I'm not arguing with that. I'm just pointing out what the states are responsible for. Final one, do you agree with Paul Keating that the Reserve Bank should be doing more, should in fact be buying government bonds directly?
I agree with Paul Keating that fiscal policy needs to do more of the heavy lifting here. I agree that we do have a full-blown jobs crisis on our hands and we need to avoid a lost generation of workers.
I'm asking about his comments on the Reserve Bank and whether it should buy bonds directly from the government.
No, I think that the first responsibility is the government's as they borrow this money, to make sure that they're getting effectiveness for it.
So you disagree with Paul Keating on that?
I agree with Paul that more needs to be done, The only difference between Paul's view and other views is where that debt sits, on whose balance sheet. I think it's been clear for some time now that the government hasn't done enough, not just during this COVID crisis, but before that as well. And the economy
just asking you about his view on
be.
whether a Reserve Bank should buy bonds. You disagree or agree?
That's not something that I've been calling for, but if anyone has earned the right to comment on the economy, it's the architect of the modern Australian economy.
You haven't been calling for it? You haven't been calling for it? You disagree with it?
My beef is not with the Reserve Bank, David. My beef's with the government, which hasn't done enough, which ensured that we came into this crisis from a position of weakness, not strength, and that's left us vulnerable.
All right, Jim Chalmers, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David.